Okay, I'm going to walk through some key points for John Dewey. And obviously, I highly encourage you to do the reading. It's really important. It is dense philosophical writing, and John Dewey was not a good writer. He does not have a very easy to read prose style. So I feel like it's a reading where if you read through it, you still might be a little bit confused about the key ideas, but if you put the reading in context with this lecture and go over some notes and kind of pull out some key points, that's a much more helpful kind of easy way to understand the reading we read for this week. So John Dewey, I would just like to point out, was what is one of our nation's most, I mean, undoubtedly prominent intellectuals, one of the most famous historians, worldwide, and he's someone who would, from the United States, who would be recognized, in colleges around the world for his contribution. So what I want you guys to get by the end is to know about the way in which John Dewey describes education, his response to Rousseau, what he thinks are the two major fallacies of that thinking, what he does believe about the nature of children and learning, and then we'll look at some other kind of aspects, what he thinks is problematic with traditional schoolings. We'll talk about his ideas of experiential learning, a little bit about teachers, and then we'll connect to democracy. One of the things I'll do is I'll send you guys a link for inventory. I'm not big on these kind of questionnaires and things, but this is one that can help you sort of root through sort of where you end up. And what I like about is that it kind of gives you a bit of a spectrum. And then two, I like to share this because I think it can be helpful. When you're applying for jobs, oftentimes a philosophy of education is asked for or used in different contexts, and this can kind of help you flesh out some of your ideas and where you end up and kind of fit philosophically. Um, this is detailed a little bit more in the we've read the chapter that sort of frames the progressive era, and that chapter talked a little bit more about pragmatism. This was a core aspect of John Dewey's belief system, and then John Dewey contributed to pragmatism, and essentially pragmatist, which we could spend several lectures talking about, but I mean, in the most simple terms, it's about finding the most achievable or workable solution to an issue. So, and what I would contrast it with is idealism. So, if you look at contemporary issues like, climate change or things like that, an idealist might have lofty ideas about ending fossil fuels and things like that. The pragmatism would maybe look more specifically at those step by step things you could do to begin to reduce emissions, things like that. So the more pragmatic approach, generally the more sort of feasible, workable solution to a problem. Um, and where I would put John Dewey too, to kind of contextualize him, his time period, behavioralism became very popular, and I would argue really ended up becoming the primary influence on education through the 20th century. John Dewey thought that stimulus and response was significant in learning, um, but he rejected the behavioralist claim, and he thought that it's not just like if a child touches a flame and realizes that it's hot and reacts to it. What John Dewey said was that real learning is more contextual. It's sort of, is the child coming to something with a certain sense of curiosity? Are they making assumptions based on prior experiences? How engaged are they? There's a lot of different dynamics that actually impact, um, learning. It's not just touching that something's hot, making a generalization, and then never, touching a stove again or something. There's a lot more contextual information that happens in that process, um, related to human development. All right, so where he opens up the piece we read is he says basically philosophy, philosophy of education can't just be reactionary or in protest. It needs to set up a vision. It needs to set up a kind of approach to the future. Now, I think the challenge with John Dewey is though that he does reject, like, it would not be Deweyan to set up a kind of, step one, do this, step two, do this, a procedural kind of approach to education. For him, it's way more of an art, it's way more based on the experiences and understanding of learners. So that's kind of a complexity in John Dewey to begin with. Um, he mentions the metal worker here as kind of a connection to this. I think this is an implicit connection to Plato. We talked about Plato and the myth of the metals. And what Dewey says in this context is, look, even something like gold, silver, bronze, they're valueless without context. Unless you can make them into something, or have some sort of vision for them, they don't end up becoming anything. And if you look at Plato, when we talked about Plato, Plato was all about education and society. Everything was about um, society, creating the best society. Um, Rousseau, on the other hand, was all about the individual. It was all about individualism and protecting the right of individuals. John Dewey thinks that's a false dichotomy, and or in some ways you could kind of say you should sort of put him in the middle. What he points out is the right society creates a place for individualism. The right society breeds ways of expressing your individuality. That's a sign of a healthy society. Likewise, though, you don't really have an individual without a society, without a relation to another group of people. And so the individual, is committed to protecting that society. All right. So the other key themes he talks about are development and growth in this area. These are two key elements of education. The way it's hard for me, again, you could spend a lot of time fleshing out Dewey's thoughts on growth. He has, books that are sections of books that are really devoted to this idea. What I would say is that's that for him is the key to education. There's no fixed aim in education. There's no outcome, and that's one of the things he complains about. Far too often, education's linked to credentials or a graduation or something like that. For Dewey, it's there are no fixed aims, but it is about growth. And one of the elements of growth for him is like a depth of experience. And the only I need to come up with a better analogy here, but the one that comes to mind for me is I went to the Grand Canyon one year when I was first in undergrad, and then I it was a beautiful experience. I took an honors geology class, and we learned about rock formations and all this information about igneous and metamorphic rock and all. And I went back to the Grand Canyon after that semester had ended, and it was just kind of a different experience. Like I looked at the rock formations in the Grand Canyon with a lot more just kind of like it was just a little bit more depth. Like I understood a little bit more. I was sort of a little more impressed with the formation and sort of geeking out a little bit more on the rocks and things like that and the formations. That's kind of an element of the growth he's talking about. That it deepens your experience. Another kind of element to this, I would say, is Dewey talks a lot about habits. And all of us probably have a lot of routine habits in our life. We get up and we go through a certain routine in the morning. We get ready for our day. We have certain patterns that we follow, in preparing for school, different things like that. And that's kind of one element of habit and ritual for Dewey. But the other one is the ability to deal with uncertainty and change. So most of us, I'm sure, have experienced this as well. We're planning, maybe it's even part of our routine is interrupted, and all of us are going through that maybe right now with with the pandemic, and it's adapting and changing to that. And that's what Dewey says schools are really good at: the first approach, that first aspect of habit of preparing for that. They're not good at developing students to deal with uncertainty in a changing world and things like that. And that's what he thinks schools should focus on. So he talks about moving from actual experiences to knowledge development. I always link this to the scientific experience, like scientific approach. You start with a hypothesis, you think of something, but you're maybe influenced by something, you see something happening, a phenomena, you develop a hypothesis, you test it, you revise it, um, you question things. That's kind of how Dewey sees things happening. And one of the things I want to point to is he says that education is like our health. It's never fixed or completed. So it's not like you would go to the doctor and get a clean bill of health or a good outcome and decide not to worry about your health anymore. Likewise, the same for him is true of education. Now, with his response to Rousseau, to set this up, there's an idea in philosophy called teleology. This is the idea that entities or life forms have a predetermined kind of internal wiring almost, or a kind of internal kind of code. One example would be the acorn. So we know an acorn is going to become an oak tree. That's kind of its internal predisposition. For Rousseau, he saw humans like this, and he thought the way to best deal with their education was to impact them the least, to kind of let them be on their own, to respect their individuality, and let them just sort of realize this inner potential. And Dewey says there are two major problems with that, and one is that humans are far more complex than seeds. Dewey says, human beings take on different forms throughout their life. All of you are probably different than you were as children. And then as well, too, are probably different in different contexts, different with your friends in certain situations than you are maybe at family events or things like that. And then ideally, hopefully you'll become someone different in the future than you are now, that you'll change and develop and grow. That's one of the key things. Dewey says humans are far more complex and um, develop and take on different forms. The other one that he says is that even something as simple as a seed and a plant is related to environmental conditions. And this is the traditional response to teleology. So, I have like 30 oak trees in my backyard. I have a ton of acorns, and 99, virtually all of them end up as squirrel food, or I end up raking them up and putting them in the garbage. So it's the environmental conditions that are essential to development. Rousseau was very influential on education through the 20th century. He influenced a lot of major thinkers on education. And Dewey said that basically the impact of Rousseau's thinking has led schools to basically think of students as either smart or dumb, well behaved or bad behaved. It ends up, he says, like conformity becomes the criteria of success. So your ability to conform to a central rule is what you get judged by in schools. And Dewey obviously thinks this is inherently flawed and a terrible impact on education. This is captured in a number of different quotes. So, but what I do want to say in relation to this, and one of the important things to note from the reading is that, so Dewey is very, very focused on individuality, a major focus on individuality and respecting individual interest. And there's a lot of terms that we get associated with Dewey: student-centered learning, child-centered learning. Another major component of Dewey is experiential learning, that all learning should involve learning through experiences and testing things and kind of developing. Um, so he does see this kind of conformity as a huge problem, but he does see two central facets of human beings. What I refer to in the notes as the nature of the child. And the question that I had posed to you is, how does Dewey see the nature of children? And there are two things. Dewey sees children as naturally curious, and I've done a number of I played videos, related to this in class to kind of illustrate this. But just if you've been around kids and children, you know that they're naturally curious. They want to know why, ask you continually about things, to the point that it can be really obnoxious sometimes. They're naturally curious. The other one is that human beings are by their nature naturally social. Those two things, curious and social. And for the social part, I've pointed to, like, if you look at research right now on solitary confinement, it's really really damaging to human being psychology. There's a push to ban uh, solitary confinement more generally, but it has been banned in a number of places for as a form of punishment for juveniles. And it's interesting to me, like, even if you're really introverted, if you're a human being, you go crazy if you're not exposed to and connected with other human beings. And so I think that's pretty fascinating, but something that Dewey picked up on and that's central to his philosophy. So, what he says is that traditional schooling fails, it ignores the diversity of needs and capacities. And then I want you to remember, he says the initiative of growth comes from the needs and the power of the individual. That is, in a sense, that all learning should come from the natural curiosity of students. It should be student driven. It should be teachers using kids, um, natural curiosity to develop. I just, because we have a young child, I read books. I've been reading books recently on child development and young children, and one that I recently read is called "The Gardener and the Carpenter," and the analogy that the author uses, and this is a Stanford professor, as a side note, or sorry, UC Berkeley, I believe, but an expert in child development. And the analogy of the book is that a carpenter sets out with something they want to accomplish. They have a plan, and they know how to get through building something. Um, what this professor says is that too many approaches to education use that format, and the opposite to that, as they see it, would be the gardener. The gardener tries to create the right environment. And so I think that's an interesting analogy, and one we've been trying to sort of think about with our own child. And some other examples of early childhood Deweyan sort of connected would be like Montessori schools use a Deweyan approach, Reggio inspired, or Reggio. That's another kind of early childhood um, interest driven approach to education. So what Dewey says is the failure to do that, the failure to recognize that growth should come, or that education should come from the natural curiosity of students, means that we have to overly rely on external motivation, grades, you know, other forms and pressure to get kids to conform. I always like to have a discussion about this in class. I think it's pretty interesting. I worked in a program that did not use grades, and I really liked it. Although I know at this point with like university classes, they would not. I just don't feel like my classes would work if I just got rid of. I mean, I wouldn't be able to do that anyway, but if I just got rid of a grading system, I don't feel like it would be successful. I think students are too sort of acclimated at this point, to not have grades. But certainly at the elementary level, I think it would be really helpful. I put some different maps up just architecturally to kind of show how Dewey sort of envisioned his schools, and that he connected things like cooking and things that happen at the home with like biology and research and art and music. He sought a well-rounded curriculum. And the other example that I've shown and given examples of is the lab schools. And so lab schools, Dewey developed, like today we have one at Ball State, which is Burris. These are Deweyan inspired schools. So one of the things I think that's a huge problem with slogans or sayings like child-centered learning or student-centered learning is that they I think it becomes a question of like, well, then what's the role of this teacher, or how would we sort of manage that? And he says that in this context, it's an even more important factor. And I would just say, when I have discussions with people about effective, whether they're Montessori schools or lab schools that do use a really genuinely Deweyan approach, they do require a lot of planning, a lot of input and understanding by teachers. And the ones that I've seen that work really well do have, either a small class size, and it's the role of the teacher to make connections, modify the environment, create a good environment, and then to make connections. If you've been around young kids too, another thing I think I've noticed is, I mean, they can sometimes just jump from experience to experience to experience, and not draw connections and things like that. And so the teachers do become important. And something else I've used to illustrate this is, there's a homeschooling movement called the unschooling movement, and there's, if you go on YouTube, you can find video blogs with parents sharing information about unschooling and, their thoughts on it. There's some famous people like Elon Musk and, Alanis Morissette, and people who, who are wealthy, who take this approach with their kids. Um, it's one of those things that, based on what I've seen, it can work incredibly well in some situations. Again, I think if the parents have the resources and involvement to make it work. But as you might guess, in some situations it can go horribly wrong. Um, One example that I point to is that, I saw one family where the kids didn't, end up really taking an interest or motivating themselves to start reading until they were teenagers, and that really does damage. I mean, it's not easy to reverse that process. Um, so yeah, that's kind of the context. He says the teacher becomes a more important factor, not a smaller, but they're kind of a partner in a common enterprise. And the other, quote that I want you to remember is, he says the teacher, like the artist, though, has the challenge of creating something, that's not a duplicate of something else. Now, John Dewey was pre Andy Warhol, so, but in his time, what he's referring to here is that artists, they don't just duplicate things; they have to envision, something unique, and they don't know always how things are going to end up. That's sort of his analogy here. All right. I think I've covered this basically, that otherwise what you end up with is a multiplicity of isolated activities without cohesion and without meaning, if you don't have a good teacher, if you don't have that right environment. Um, so democracy is another major element. I mean, one of Dewey's major works is, Democracy in Education. Um, it's just hard to sum up in a short period of time, but essentially, it's almost like, for Dewey, democracy is like an organism. It evolves and changes. It's not inherent. There are outside threats, things that threaten democracy, things I think that we're facing today, and things that in his time were really profound. Dewey, when the piece that we read was written, just after World War One and on the precipice of World War Two. So Dewey is the talk that we read is basically, he's in South Africa. We're staring down the barrel of World War Two, of the Holocaust, and he talks about this rise of nationalist, sentiment, and, racism, and these other issues that exist in society. And so for Dewey, children need to, through their education, they need to learn and understand how to participate in democratic forms of life. This is something that schools, I think, right now are suffering from tremendously: a lack of civic education, focus on civics, focus on voting and engagement and things like that. It's just something that over the last 10 to 15 years, there has just been, really over the last 20 years, just a major decline, in a situation that already wasn't great to begin with. I think schools try to do things like student government, but have really, not engaged in really meaningful, forms of democratic engagement, and, something that I think that we suffer from. So again, when he talks about the significance of his time period, um, it is a pretty dramatic time. The environment is a major, focus of his, sort of in this section, creating the right environment. So if you were going to have student-centered learning, I think Dewey still feels that the school needs to be the right place, that it needs to happen in this controlled environment. And, I just, when I was thinking about this, at one stage, I had read a book it was a memoir of a child soldier in Africa, and it was just really, and who had changed his life around, but dramatically. But it was just compelling how significant, the different environments can impact, children. I want you to know the aim of education for him, it's its application in improving the common life of all. So there's this major emphasis on contribution. I think that today, when you look at research too, that it bears it out that that people tend to be happier and more fulfilled when they're able to contribute to something more significant than themselves, whether that's through their work or through their their contribution in their family relationships, things like that. So, all right. I hope this helps summarize again, kind of the key points. Again, I would recommend going through the reading. Some of the quotes and different information are important, and hopefully, the reading notes that I shared will help you with that process.